to introduce Fay Bound Alberti. She's a reader in history and a UKRI Future Leaders Fellow, at York University. She's also published very extensively, and she's one of the most striking academics who can write books that are based on deep research and also reach very wide audiences. So you may want to follow up her book, A Biography of Loneliness, that was published in 2019. And here's a comment I found about it online, which I thought was quite wonderful. Poignant and instructive. Read it for work, but value it for life. Compliments don't come much higher than that. She's also the author of This Mortal Coil, The Human Body in History and Culture from 2016, and of Matters of the Heart, History, Medicine and Emotion from 2010. So Fay, welcome, and thank you very much for agreeing to take part in this conversation.
Thanks so much, Ludmilla. It's a real pleasure, and thank you for your very kind introduction. I'm really happy to be here. It's an exciting series. Can't wait to talk.
Right. So we're going to start by thinking a little bit about Fay's project. So Fay, if you could start by outlining the project and also how you came to be interested in this topic of faces and face transplants.
Yeah, so my background is the history of medicine, of emotion, of cosmetic surgery in the body, and all of those things come together in the face. And the project that I'm funded by the UKRI to investigate is the emotional and cultural history of facial difference and transplantation, essentially from 2005 to now, but especially in the sort of 1950s period when cosmetic surgery and some of the techniques used in transplantation first came into play. The project is very interdisciplinary, so it uses sociology, anthropology, history, literary studies, and it also works with a range of different, it's not a great term, but stakeholders. So from surgeons, nurses, extended teams who work on facial reconstruction and transplantation, people living with facial difference, and all kinds of community groups who have a vested interest, including academically ethicists, historians of science and medicine, and so on. So it's a very wide-ranging project. Our main partnerships, we have six in the UK, 6 hospital sites in the UK, although that research at the moment has kind of halted because of COVID. And we have collaborations in Boston and Helsinki in particular, are the ones that we're working on. So it's an international project. It didn't start out, it started out as an Anglo-American project, but it's become quite international as a result of the kind of work that we have uncovered during our research. It's been in process since May 2019. And
why did you pick this topic?
Because my interest in the face as a way of thinking about emotion, selfhood, and identity meant that when I started learning about, through cosmetic surgery, came across face transplants, the ethical and emotional and cultural challenges of a face transplant are clear. Whether or not they actually are enacted through the process of transplantation, there are a number of alarms that people have in their head when they think about facial transplantation. And unbelievably, there's going to be a sequel soon to the Face Off movie by John Woo in 1997. And the sequel, yet again, there's been several instances of this at the moment, very clunky, untheoretical, unsympathetic accounts of face transplants that have become dramatic episodes of history that follow this history of understanding transplantation as something that is somehow spooky science or sort of Frankenstein science. I'm very interested in how we have this incredible cutting edge, literally cutting edge, innovative surgery that is somehow still out of kilter with ideas about selfhood, identity, and emotions. And that's the gap that this project is seeking to address by saying, I'm not just interested in writing the first history of face transplants as an international form of innovative surgery. I'm also interested in showing surgeons how this kinds of work in the arts and humanities is really critical in understanding whether or not a surgery is successful.
Yeah, there's a lot to pick up there, but we're both historians, so our default position is to say, where did this come from? How long have people been talking about this? So could you give us some historical context, please?
Absolutely. So we have an article that's coming out any day, really, in the Journal for the History of Medicine and Allied Sciences, which is the first mapping exercise that I wrote with my colleague, Victoria Hoyle. And it's the first time that the history of face transplants has been mapped internationally. There have been 47 to date. That includes 2 retransplantations. And people started talking about it from the 1980s, when there was lots of experimentation around transplantation. It started being talked about more seriously in the 1990s. In 2000, there were discussions in the UK about doing the first face transplant. That's when the Royal College of Surgeons stepped in and said, society isn't ready for this. And then in 2005, the very first facial transplant, which was a partial transplant, took place in France on Isabelle Dinois. And it was covered very extensively in the national and international media. This was a woman, 38-year-old divorcee, who had taken an overdose. And I'm sorry, some of the things that I'm going to say, I'm not showing any images, but some of the things I'm going to say might be distressing to people. So there's a warning. So while she was unconscious, her dog chewed off this portion of her face. And the surgeons that undertook this face transplant had previously applied for the ethical permissions in France and been turned down. And that was because it was an abstract patient and a full face. This time the surgeons went forward with Isabelle in mind and just this part of the face. They received the permission, it went ahead. For various reasons, it was announced in the media before the patient was ready. There's a lot of ethical entanglements around that. But since then, there has been what we could call a face race, where all around the world, it's become a way of showing how innovative and how leading you are as a reconstruction and transplant team if you can undertake this surgery. Not all have been successful. There are huge issues with immunosuppressants. And there are also issues with psychological rehabilitation. And we're working with these teams who are doing it to see what can be learned from this history, this very recent history.
So transplantation as an idea is actually not particularly new. I mean, we might think of people like John Hunter at the end of the 18th century doing tooth transplants. Yeah. So what's different about face transplants? Can we unfold that a bit?
Yeah, well, I think that face transplants are different. I mean, first off, the skin is is an organ that rejects much quicker than any other body part. And that makes sense, given the skin is always reproducing and keeping us healthy. And as you say, transplantation as a concept, as an idea, has been around for a very long time. It's only really in the 1950s. We have kidney transplants. We have this the ability to suppress the immune system so that a person can take on another organ. That's why everything changes with cyclosporine. And there have been issues, as I've written about in Matters of the Heart. There are other parts of the body that have emotive significance. So heart transplants, we can't see it, but we can feel it in the chest and we can hear it. And those sort of sensory things provide an emotional attachment. So it's not uncommon for people whose loved ones have had heart transplants to feel an emotional connectedness to the heart when it's transplanted. Now, the difference with face transplants is that, like hand transplants, these are parts of the body that are visible, and they're parts of the body that are social, and they're parts of the body that are communicative. So we use our hands and our faces. Now, and moving on, I would argue, from the importance of hand transplants, or the problematic cultural importance of hand transplants, is the fact that the face tends to be a signifier for our identity, our genetic identity, our citizenship, as well as our emotions and how we feel. When we recognize people or think about people that we care about, we think about their faces. So there's a lot of reasons why the face is different. And it was redefined as an organ in order for face transplants to take place. But of course, it's not just an organ in terms of its social and cultural significance. And that's one of the things that, we have to explore around the exchange of a face as a kind of surgical. It's a very, very skillful thing to do. Nevertheless, there is much more that is in theory being transplanted.
So you're saying it's technically more complex, it's socially more complex, and it's emotionally more complex, if we can put quite a lot into the notion of emotion.
Yeah, I think that's probably fair, yeah.
So could we use your project to think a bit about the role of faces in societies?
Yeah. And so the project is really, at its core, it's really interested in why the face. Why is the face so important? And why is what is called facial disfigurement, but we prefer in the project to refer to as facial difference? Why is it so challenging? And of course, one of the reasons why people are opposed to face transplants, and what I would like to do is distinguish between different types of face transplants before I explain this. The first face transplant was very much involving just the skin and the surface parts of the face. More radical face transplants from around about the 2010s involved the replacement of things like the jaw, so the bones, the structure of the face itself. And there have been face transplants now that involve the whole of the scalp as well as the face. So there are degrees of facial transplantation. And that's important because we tend to think about face transplants as a cosmetic procedure, but often it's a functional procedure. You know, if you can't eat, you can't talk, you can't swallow, you can't smell, these are aspects of what it is to be human. And one of the reasons why these are so critical is that when you have gunshot injuries, particularly self-inflicted gunshot injuries, where the bullet has gone underneath and just wiped out much of the structure of the face, it is not possible to survive. It's not simply that facial reconstruction is not such an aesthetic outcome in the view of the transplant surgeons. It's also that it's not possible to survive. So alongside this kind of historical trajectory of face transplants as a form of procedure, we have to balance that against the fact that people are more and more self-conscious about their faces. There's all of this stuff on social media. So there is a rising concern about the face anyway, and much more emphasis on face apps and transforming your face, and cosmetic surgery is also has been on the rise since the 1980s. So it's balancing this this concern with how we look and how we feel about how we look with the functional parts of what the face is doing. And those two come together in really complex ways.
I wonder, thank you. I wonder if at this point you could tell us just a little bit about how the project is organized and the sort of things, you know, in sort of more specific terms that the project is actually doing.
Yes. So it's set up in a way that works with the various stakeholders that I've described. So on the one hand, the website has a timeline of facial transplantation alongside other forms of surgical development and innovation. So that's the spine of the project, if we're going to use medical imagery. And then what we have been doing and what we are doing has been affected quite considerably by COVID. So it's using a lot of testimony about face transplants from face transplant recipient themselves, stories about people who have facial reconstruction work. We're working with ethicists, looking at how medical ethics have been shaped around face transplants and why they might be different within the broader history of innovation, and also working with these teams around the UK and overseas. And part of that is because the ways in which surgical teams operate is very often unthinkingly part of a trajectory, a historical trajectory. It's embodied practice that is part of how things are done, and the ways in which surgeons will often trace their trajectory, in particular back to Harold Gillies in World War I and Archibald McIndoe in World War II. And that lineage is critical because it shapes the ways in which the work of the surgeons is understood. There's very much a sense of, regard and care for the patients, and this concern to make, to fix faces as much as possible. And so on the one hand, we're very appreciative of that and respectful of that. But at the same time, we're asking, what does it mean to fix a face? What is the context here? And what are the implications in terms of gender, race, ethnicity? What are the cultural and religious beliefs that are going on? And ultimately, what we are doing is shaping the first history of face transplants over this long period, but also helping to develop a way of thinking through historically informed psychological protocols. So what can surgeons learn? Because one of the most surprising things to me, although I've done a lot of interdisciplinary work, was realizing how little comparative data there is out there, how little has been exchanged and shared. And part of the reason for that is, well, partly it's historical. It's how modern medicine has evolved and split up the body and the face into different parts and processes and specialisms. But it's also about funding. It's how funding structures work. So in the US in particular, there's a drive to be different and to be competitive and to do the first. It's this face race idea, which means that it's often very difficult to kind of address at a theoretical level what has actually happened. Even how many transplants have taken place has taken a long time to work out. So most people aren't aware that it's as high as 47, including 2 retransplants.
Yes.
Mm.
As I understand it, your project could be understood as medical history, medical humanities, in a very wide and generous sense. Mm. And a few moments ago, you mentioned a film, but I did wonder to what extent your project is engaging with questions of literature, art history, film studies, and so on.
Yes, absolutely. So this is one of the core strands of the project, is to look at what we might call, in a kind of a lazy shorthand way, cultural representations. So especially literature and film, and the context in which cultural understandings about face transplants emerge, which is very different to the ways in which we understand face transplants as being represented in the media as fact. So in some ways, it's often that sort of cognitive dissonance, this idea that, you know, we can believe that it's very important to have this sort of surgery, but at the same time we're horrified by it unless we need it. And it's all of those sorts of entanglements. What we're doing at the moment, the next step of the project, so this whole 18 months period was supposed to be traveling around the world and doing the research and getting stuck into it. Now this is the focus for the next year, is to look more closely at these theoretical, these cultural ideas, and how they inform the surgical attitudes, as well as patients' attitudes, as well as more fundamentally attitudes to people with facial difference.
So if people who are on this event had any suggestions about cultural artifacts that might be relevant,
that would be fantastic. Please share them in the chat or drop me a line. I mean, I'm, as you say, this is a medical humanities project, and I am enormously aware and interested in what's happening at Durham, and any help I can get in this area will be fantastic. Because part of what I'm really interested in, but find hard to access, is what are we doing when we're looking at a face or we're looking at ourselves, and it's that. So you know, I would be very grateful for any suggestions.
I did just want to mention what I think is a brilliant example of what you've been talking about, which is the portrait of Simon Weston, who was in the National Portrait Gallery in London, who was burned during the Falklands War and has been really quite an activist, as I understand it, Fay. Yeah. And I think it's really important that we engage with work like that. I find it incredibly moving. And one of the things is about how the artist makes the lines of the paint follow the scars on his face. It's an extraordinarily powerful, I don't want to say statement, because that implies that it's static. But it's something that permits conversation and that we can develop relationships with and responses to. Yes, definitely. And I think it's a wonderful portrait, as you say, and it's very much a portrait of a man as well as his face and all. I mean, it's that, and I think that's really what's very interesting to me, is that sort of self-representation, and also the ways in which the movement from, you know, self-portraiture to selfies and the different media, but also what is coming into play in terms of how people are situating themselves or being situated. It's absolutely fascinating to me. You know that we're working with Eleanor Crook, who's a wonderful sculptor, and she is one of our collaborators on the project, and she is intending to make a bust of Adam Pearson
who is an actor who lives with facial difference. And the plan would be to have that in the National Portrait Gallery as well. So we're interested very much in looking at, as you say, it's the texture, it's the lines, it's all of the composition and how these are different in photographs or, you know, mirrors or paintings. But it's also, we're interested in producing it and being sort of self-consciously critical about how we produce these outputs.
Yes. Yes, I think that self-consciousness is so important. Now, it's been going a couple of years now.
Yeah, since May 2019. Yeah.
Nearly a couple of years.
Nearly.
So is it too soon to ask you to say whether you have any findings that you'd like to share?
Well, the findings that we've got so far have been based on these mapping exercises that we've been doing. I think this at this point, what's been very critical definitely has helped shape some of the principles and the approaches of our key surgeons, has been to map out the areas in the world where face transplants are happening, to talk about the differences between them in terms of the kinds of patients that are being worked with, the kinds of results, the kinds of things that have brought them there. There are some very important issues around gender. For instance, most women who have received face transplants have received them as a result of violence, particularly male violence, and that's quite striking. Most men, it has been work-related in the main, so accidents in the course of work. And it's a little early to say, but I've really noticed some very important differences in psychological recovery as a result. And that's something that I'm thinking through at the moment. The ways in which our ideas of the self are very heavily gendered and obviously about appearance. When Isabelle Denoir received her face transplant in 2005, partly because it was the first time, but also because there was a salaciousness around the media about her ability to kiss, whether she was behaving as an appropriate patient, and also actually the surgeons talking about her as sleeping beauty and her skin, and it was very eroticized, it was very problematic. She never recovered any sort of psychological well-being or strength, never reintegrated back into the community in a way that we would expect to see now. And yet, by contrast, when men are talked to about their faces, it's not the same thing. There's a language of heroism wrapped up. I mean, particularly when you think about instances like Simon Weston, of course, it's often the case that men receive these injuries in the course of heroic duties. So the gender issue is very important. Issues around race and ethnicity are important. There's only been one African-American transplant. There's been 2 Black people transplanted. But the African-American one was a very interesting case because the patient turned down a transplant because it wasn't quite the right color. And it was so important to him that it's surprising that it wasn't more recognized at the time. But of course, the thing is that there's very few faces available because people don't really like to give up the faces of loved ones. And that's something that I think means that face transplants, they have a shelf life. I think we have a real challenge here. This is not going to be rolled out as a sort of well, it's never been a quick fix, but it's never going to be rolled out as a kind of first port of call solution. So I think the findings at an international level are also around, you know, the desire to be first, the lack of funding available, the relationship between surgeons and patients, the extent to which there is regard for psychological health. All of these things vary according to where the procedures are carried out. So that international context, as I say, has changed since I've been doing this work, and it's been really surprising to me. And I think it will be interesting now that we have that mapping to really look at the cultural shifts that are also going to be internationally different.
I think in everything you've said, there are hints about the ethical complexities of face transplants, and I would like to come on to that. But one thing that struck me just hearing you talk today is you're very clear that this is about surgery. It's not about the whole of medicine. And historians and sociologists are very familiar with the idea that there is a rather distinctive way of thinking about surgery from the outside and experiencing it from the inside. And I wondered if you could just say a couple of things about that.
Gosh, that's absolutely fascinating. I'm not really sure what to say about that. I mean, I think, yeah, I think as a historian of medicine, this is the first time that I've really settled on surgery. And I have found it a very different experience. Partly because surgeons are very distinctive characters, partly because, I mean, generally in the past, I've sort of mapped the shift from understanding the body as a sort of holistic entity and the body as a, you know, towards the body, a set of materially governed systems and all of these things that inform medical practices. But there is something very different about the people who practice surgery, what happens, and the act of that sort of going within and going inside. And also I think there's something different too about the ways people feel about their surgeons. When, you know, somebody is going inside their body, they are going to respond in a different way to them, and that trying to disentangle that degree of kind of emotional relationship is very hard. And often it's unthinking and unconscious on the part of the surgeons. You know, they ask the questions, they get the answers they expect, and there's no recognition necessarily that there might be reasons that are beyond the basics of surgery within that. So although they are enormously, all of them are enormously committed to their patients and committed to the outcome and sensitive, and psychologists are involved all the way along, but there is still that kind of often a sort of lack of recognition of the whole patient that is somehow beyond that kind of focal lens. Yeah.
I recently read The Citadel by A.J. Cronin, who was himself a physician.
Right.
But on 2 occasions, he describes a surgeon behaving in the way that his readers would be familiar with from popular fiction.
Right. Yeah.
And I thought that was very telling, that he was able to see all those connections, because when you're reading the book, you're thinking, oh, I'm reading popular fiction.
Yeah.
But he only does it in relation to surgeons.
That's very interesting.
But anyway, I don't want to interrupt the flow of your ideas at all. So can we try and tackle a little bit this question of ethics? So obviously there's a field called medical ethics. On the whole, it takes place in a different space from medical history, maybe less so in the case of medical humanities. But I sense that you're not really interested in there being a separate set of questions about medical ethics. What you're interested in is showing how medical ethics are part of everything you're thinking about. So would you like to show us how that works?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, if we take the British example, where the Royal College of Surgeons did not approve the attempts at the Royal Free to undertake the first face transplant, technically, that did not mean that legally the Royal Free couldn't do it, but it would be a very brave and foolhardy surgical team who were prepared to fly in the face of the Royal College. Should anything go wrong, then that would be pretty disastrous for everybody concerned. Even though the Royal College said no, the internal ethics committee said yes. And so those ethical processes continued, even though we had this sort of international sort of surgical storm about rights and responsibilities. And one of the interesting things about that Royal College discussion, and we have an article coming out about that, is the ways in which it was very separate from the work of the ethics committees. And I think sometimes medical ethics, or the history of medical ethics, could very easily, I can see how I could easily write a history of committees rather than a history of the sort of entanglements involved. There's a real shift in terms of face transplants from the 80s to the 90s to the 2000s, when the ethics committees start being more involved and start shaping what is considered acceptable. And I'm interested in how what is considered acceptable intersects with what the surgeons feel they need to do. So I've had this before in relation to breast implants. When breast implants started becoming possible, there was some things needed to happen at the same time, one of which was surgical skills. So we have all of these wartime skills and nobody to practice on. And there had to be a material available that you could use to make breasts bigger, that felt like a real breast. And you had to have the surgeons who could do it, but you also had to have need. And what happened is the idea of small breastedness or hypomastia was created as a psychiatric condition, which coincided with all of this concern in, Hollywood kind of suddenly had Marilyn Monroe's and this sort of very different version of a feminine form. And surgeons were able to say, there is a clinical need, I have the ability and I have the tools and I can fix this. And so that became an ethical solution to satisfy women who were distressed. And that's been the sort of, and I'm not suggesting there's conspiracy here, it's the ways in which these things come together. So in terms of the actual practice of medicine, that is a very different thing than ethical rules and regulations. Ethical rules and regulations are very important, but through a lot of oral history interviews, what I have learned is the ways in which they are navigated, negotiated, sometimes completely ignored. And I'm always surprised when surgeons tell me this. And of course, that's part and parcel of doing oral history, is that you hear things that you're not supposed to hear. So for me, the ethical story is very much about, we have ethical dilemmas around the face, and they are to do with how we feel about our faces, how we feel about the faces of those we love, how we feel about immunosuppressants. Is it okay to extend someone's life for 10 years if we know that they are going to be rejected and they are going probably to die as a result, but we're giving them a better image during that period, although we're massively transforming the face in ways that we don't know what the implications will be. I feel as though what we're dealing with is this sort of, it's ethics in practice. It's this ongoing kind of negotiation of what it is to be ethical, what it is to be a good surgeon, what it is to have a good form of success. And that's a very different dynamic form of ethics that I've experienced during this project.
But you also have ethical challenges, including whether you can publish certain kinds of insights that you've been privy to. And I wonder if you could just think there's one more area I'd like to cover, but before we do.
As someone who has not before worked on the histories of people who are living, I found this quite an adjustment. I mean, not just the emotional adjustment of engaging with trauma, which is itself ethical has ethical concerns in terms of my team and my own ability to manage the demands, the emotional demands, but also my heartfelt commitment and responsibility to people who are sharing their stories, to people who are living with visible difference. And a sort of a collective sense of just trying to do good in the research. And obviously what that means, and it has to be a commitment that I decide is important as the PI, and then we are writing it into how we do things. But as you say, it's also about showing images, for example. Most of the time I don't show images because these are people. And this is something that really struck me, this links back to the thing about cosmetics versus the functional. We did a YouGov survey asking people how they felt about facial transplantation, and we did it with some surgeons, a fantastic team that we worked very closely with. We wrestled with them over whether or not one of the questions should be, how do you feel about face transplants, and showing a series of images. And the images were all before and after. I wrote about this for the Lancet. The images are always before and after, and they're always a person at the most difficult point of their journey versus made up, beautified, completed, in theory, surgically. And the challenge was, nobody's going to look at those images and say, this is a bad idea, or there must be more behind the scenes. And so that's an ethical challenge too, is how do we physically, even beyond my responsibilities or our responsibilities to the patient and to the surgical teams, what are our responsibilities in communicating what this surgery is doing to this in this broader field of how we look at faces. So yeah, we're constantly navigating these kinds of questions, and I probably at the very end of the project I'll have a better way of kind of articulating what they are, but at the moment we're just really just trying to be self-aware, reflexive, balance the desire to create new learning in this area alongside the impact of what that learning might mean.
And I think you and I are agreed that it will be good if historians can talk more about these kinds of things.
Definitely.
So I think if there are any historians with us at the moment and they would like to be part of those conversations, that would also be interesting for us to hear. So you've really made a beautiful segue into the last area I wanted to explore, which is the media. And there's now a lot of interest in the relationship between science, medicine, and the media. And I've been quite struck recently that there've been a couple of reports, in fact, on the BBC News website, which have had quite explicit photographs, including of the black face transplant, which was in profile, and therefore you could see the joins, as it were, I don't know what else to call it, on one side of the face. And I must say, I found that quite upsetting. And I think it's because you can very quickly imagine the kind of suffering, but the suffering isn't actually being represented. It's a bit clinical, actually, which is, how could it be otherwise? So I'm not being critical of them, but I wonder if that's something you could just talk about a little bit. And then I'm going to ask Andrew if he could tell us about some of the questions and so on that are coming in. Thank you.
Yeah. It's really interesting, that question about the join. And I've been thinking about this quite a lot, because there are patients like Katie Stubblefield, who was a very young girl, just 18, I think, or younger, when she shot herself in the face. And the images that were circulated and that they were shortlisted, some of them, for the Wellcome Image Prize, very much focused on that line. And that's obviously very different to because we are looking at that surgical act there. And one of the things that we've been doing with Lucy Burscoe, who is an artist who worked on a project called Facing Out at Manchester, which was working with people at Christie's Hospital and painting people who had experienced some sort of facial cancer. And the exhibition was fantastic because the people involved had their portraits painted, but they also got to choose 3 objects from the collection that represented them. And so her portraits were very much a sense of a whole being with some sort of facial difference. And one man had lost an eye to cancer. And there was a sense of that person having a journey. And one of the people that Lucy worked with, called Graham, I talked about his series of portraits in a Lancet article, because it's an incredible and moving series of portraits where Graham has a form of cancer that is eating away at his face. And I think there's 5. And you see there's a surgical intervention, there's a metal plate put in. And then I think it's on the 3rd portrait, it all starts to go wrong. And the tissue becomes necrotic and starts to die. And the most dramatic thing for me is that you can see in his eyes, it's the eyes. So it's not about, these portraits are not remotely about, they contain the surgical intervention, but it's the person. And so and that's what got me thinking really about that process where there is never a before and after, or you put on a mask and that's it, you become somebody else and these scars just fade. There's always that process where you will have rejection with a face transplant. You have to look at yourself and check that your skin is not rejecting. You have a different relationship with yourself as a result. So there's never a before and after, but there's a back and forth. And I think one of the challenges in the ways that we represent face transplants in the media in the way that you're describing is that it gives this image. It's a very static image, isn't it? That there's a surgical outcome and that's it. And that's just not how medicine or surgery works. It's not how people work, is it?
No.
So, yeah.
No. Thank you. Andrew, would you like to share any comments or questions at this point? You're muted.
Thank you. We have a couple of questions that have come in on the Q&A. The first one says, I wondered how photography is used as part of the planning and post-op documentation of these surgeries, and whether there are any similar discussions about ethics and representations involved there, both within the medical team and between the patient and medical team.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you, Christina. Yes, I think that this is one of those areas of work that was going to be quite a significant focus of our hospital visits over this year that we have been unable to do our hospital visits, which is really frustrating. Definitely, it's something that we are going to do more of when we can go back into the hospital. There are incredibly important ethical images in how the patient, as you say, is represented in that sort of before or after dimension, but also the sort of sleight of hand by which the person is usually, because by that point they'll have a publicist, by the end result they'll have a publicist, they tend to be made up, they tend to have an eye on all of their different media engagements, and it's not just still photography, it's about the videos that are shown, it's about the sort of the routine. I'm trying to think of the word really, but it's just the commodification of their new image. So there are very important aspects there, and there's also the different ways in which that is looked at by the surgical team, by the prosthetists as well, which is something that I'm thinking more and more about, and by the patient. So absolutely, it is something that we're going to do more on. I think it's very, very important. Yeah.
Super.
And
Andrew,
we have about that would be great.
Andrew, would you like to give us another question?
Yeah, sure. There's another one below. I don't know whether Ludmilla and Fay can, but I'll read it out though for the benefit of everyone. The face is the locus of the self's boundary, identity, and also relatedness with others. It isn't an organ, so its transplantation is a very particular phenomenon, as you pointed out earlier, and its experience must be phenomenologically highly complex. What sorts of accounts have you gathered so far of patients' experiences? How do they adjust, if they do at all? Does a face become the previous self in virtue of a face being in part constituted by the individually specific motions of its parts? Do previous facial habits help reconstitute the new face, or does the gaze of others drastically condition and limit the possibility of the new face mapping onto the old one?
Yes, thank you, Andrew, and thank you, Noga, for your question. There's a lot of very important points there. I think the most interesting thing is this idea of facial habits, because, of course, if you're replacing the muscle and the tissue and the bone, you're not going to have anything that's of the previous remaining. And one of the challenges of these surgeries is that at the moment, there's very few cases where you have significant mobility afterwards. So you move your face differently, not just because it's a different face, but because you don't have the complex nerves that joined up that you would have had with your original face. Believe it or not, which is another striking thing that I discovered when I started researching this project, there's very little information about patients' experiences themselves, beyond which you can find in the media, which is why the work that we're doing with hospitals and with extended surgical teams has been so important, because it provides us the access to these patients. So we're working with Brigham and Women's Hospital in Boston in determining the kinds of questions that need to be asked to really access this question. There's also something else to consider, which is, relates us back to this whole before and after question, which is, of course, how a person feels immediately after transplantation, which is when they're asked, is going to be different to how they feel in 5 years, or if they make it 10 years in 10 years. So, as all of us feel different about our faces on a daily basis, it's exactly the same for patients. And of course, they are always patients. I don't like to refer to them as patients, but that's what they will be for the rest of their lives. So I think there are some really important questions there. And the most honest answer is we're at a very early stage in knowing this, which is why all of this arts and humanities focus is just so important, to try to move beyond this, you know, the tissue match and the immunological questions.
I expect there are other questions and comments, but I wondered if at this point, Fay, you could say something about how people might follow the project. I mean, there will be conferences, seminars. Yeah. Can people put comments on the website? I think Andrew's going to put the website address into the chat. Would you like to say a little bit about how the, you know, people who are here today might participate?
Well, I would love to have more involvement, and if you want to be in touch, we have a website, aboutfaceyork.com. We have an Instagram and a Twitter feed. The Instagram has been quite interesting because obviously we don't want to put images of people up there that have had transplant surgery, but what we've done is try to develop, we did some work for the Being Human Festival on how people feel about their face, and we've included lots of videos there. We would love to have more engaged conversations with people about the kinds of work we're doing, and what we've aimed for in our website is to create spaces where there's quite a lot of resources and there's quite a lot of opportunity for people to feedback on what we're doing. We do have a new seminar series. There's two actually. One is on the history of emotions generally, that's about face, and one is doing history, which we've developed as part of my co-directorship of the Centre for Global Health Histories, both of which engage with these questions of gender, ethnicity, and practice and ethics, and how we even work on these subjects at all. We, in addition to these seminars, we will have, scheduled for year 4 was going to be this big international conference, but of course it will probably be a year later now. But if you follow us on social media and check out our website, then there'll be more information about that as it develops. And also we have a blog, and we are always really keen to find people who would like to write for the blog in any way about faces and identity. So do drop us a line.
And I think this is such a rich area that we would almost certainly like to invite you back if you're willing to indulge us in that. Andrew, could we have a couple more questions, please?
No one submitted anything yet.
Are there any comments that strike you that you might like to share?
I'm just seeing whether anyone wishes to ask another question or comment on it.
Because I have another question for Fay while you're doing that, if that's okay. Mm-hmm. So Fay, you and I have talked a lot and known each other for a long time, but one of the things we've never talked about, I think, is what the role of compassion might be in historical practice. Mm. And I wondered if you had any thoughts about that.
You know, it's really interesting, but our first seminar yesterday for the Centre for Global Health Histories was Julie Parle talking about compassion and end-of-life care. And I was thinking quite a lot about compassion and what it is to be a good doctor or a good surgeon, and the ways in which that shapes a surgical team on the, you know, so in terms of actual practice, how those kinds of ideas about practice, and also how difficult it is to maintain those kinds of ideas and interests within the context of kind of a busy workplace with different competing interests. I'm interested in how we conceptualize historically, of course, this idea of compassion, because as a historian of emotion, I do not think it is a universal or an unchanging thing. I'm interested in how it plays out in different contexts. One example of this is people are much more compassionate when people have had face transplants as a result of an accident. They're not very compassionate when it's as a result of a suicide attempt. So that's a really interesting way of thinking some of this through. Even people, through our surveys, even people who were tremendously compassionate about the suffering involved, if it was in any way self-inflicted, or they did not feel that it was enough to warrant any psychological problems, then the compassion disappeared. So I'm very interested in how compassion functions as a sort of I suppose, how it can be used, how it can be weaponized in some contexts, but also how it can be exploited. It's also about, I think, the ways in which people position themselves as subjects of compassion. And so that's very much about the stories that are being told and so on. So yeah, I think it runs through all of this, but it operates in different ways. And the bit, as I said, that I'm most sort of intrigued by is this notion of it works across all transplant cases, is a deserving or an undeserving recipient. If you think about liver transplants and alcoholism.
Indeed.
Yeah, we see
so I've done a bit of work on the artist John Bellamy,
right,
who had a liver transplant and did these extraordinary images, including of his surgeon, Roy Kang, but was definitely in the undeserving category. Andrew, do we have more questions?
I don't think, no questions have come in.
Okay.
Oh, hang on, I think one has just, sorry, there is another one. Christina asks, how about another historical question that occurs to me? Does the project find that the historical sources on, e.g., facial scarring, / impact of strokes or palsy or birthmarks, etc., all of which must have been common, are discussed or represented, offers fruitful comparisons for understanding faces across a longer period and different cultures?
It really does, Christina, particularly in relation to emotional response. So one of the things I've been quite struck by, and it's part of the rationale for tending to patients and for wanting to fix faces, is there's a narrative that it's perfectly normal for people to be disgusted by a face that looks different, that it's part of our, it's sort of like, it's almost like a sort of post-1920s thing about, you should look your best, that's your social responsibility, all of this stuff. And the challenge is, if we look back historically, that wasn't the case at all. So studies of facial difference in early modern periods, for instance, by Patricia Skinner and others, shows that those sorts of issues don't really apply at all. And so, although I think that we don't want to suggest that there's suddenly in the social media age a sort of rapid, miraculous transformation in people feeling differently about their faces, there is definitely more focus on sort of moral responsibility for appearance. Although we have this, as people like James Partridge talked about, faces have always been talked about in terms of beauty being goodness and ugliness being evil, and all of those kind of layered classical assumptions. But what I'm suggesting is that it's people's attitudes towards facial difference has really changed, and so that is interesting to look at over time, and it provides a useful historical way of thinking about what it is that surgeons are doing when we talk about that sort of act of heroism of transformation. Because there is an argument from people who work in cosmetic surgery that it simply reinforces the standards of beauty that some people find so challenging. And I'm not talking just about face transplants here, of course, but more generally about facial and cosmetic surgery.
Hey, I can't thank you enough. You've been so generous, and I think this is very much in the spirit of the kind of research that you do, and something I hope we can, all keep exploring. Thank you to everyone who joined. We will have our next one in 2 weeks, when I will be talking to Vicky Coltman from the University of Edinburgh about her work on portraiture. And I'm very excited that we've got an additional session in June, which is going to be about the faces of clocks by a curator who is about to publish a big book on the history of clocks. So we're open to many different ways of approaching the question of faces. If you have ideas, please just email me. Our emails at Durham are in the public domain. And if you'd like to join the CVAC newsletter, if you haven't already done so, Andrew can pop the CVAC mailing list address in. And I'm going to thank Fay enormously for being such a wonderful interlocutor. And I'm now going to read through the comments because I haven't had a chance to do that so far. So warm wishes to everybody, stay safe and well, and hope to see a lot of you in a couple of weeks. Thanks again.
Thank you.